Jean-Francois Lyotard came up with the bumper sticker version of what postmodernity is in response to a 1978 commission by the Canadian government, a report on knowledge. And his definition is postmodernity is an incredulity towards metanarratives, a distrust of the overarching stories that we tend to tell ourselves. And these, of course, were very much rooted in the Enlightenment idea that somehow through the discovery of reason we could put it to progress towards some great state of emancipation. So Lyotard is attacking this central idea that we can still have the confidence of the Enlightenment and modern rationality in working out our great sort of, the issues of the day. Now, Lyotard's incredulity towards metanarratives was, in some senses, anticipated by the cultural collapse of communism. The cultural collapse of communism manifests later in the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the implications of that. So, there's two issues that Lyotard wants to bring out in this question of incredulity towards metanarratives. There are two implications of this. The first one is that, in contrast to the Enlightenment and the kinds of mode of thinking within modernity, but the idea that we are progressively developing under some grand overarching narrative towards the final state of human emancipation, well, that's proved to be wrong. Cultural collapse of communism really sort of put the nail in the coffin of those great aspirational, progressive moves on the part of people like Lyotard. We can't tell these big, expansive stories. So part of what Lyotard is saying when he talks about the incredulity towards metanarratives is that we have to tell much more locally grounded, rooted stories. Take, for example, the crisis of immigration that's happening around the Mediterranean and the cost implications for that. How do we adjudicate between attending to that crisis or spending money on sending out some big spaceship out into the galaxy? There are massive implications there for the nature of funding, and we often choose one over the other, justifying it by an appeal to an overarching narrative about the development of human technology and its goodness for us, but often at the expense, say, of all those lives in the Mediterranean. So, on the one hand, Lyotard is saying that we can no longer tell these big stories to locate ourselves within this progressive view of history working towards our own emancipation. Instead, we've lost that, and we really have to return just to the kinds of local narratives that we provide. Actually, you see this nicely exemplified in the difference between the first and second Star Trek. In the first Star Trek, it's very much modernist, boldly going out where no man has been before, etc. But what we find in the later Star Trek is we find them actually trying to return home, trying to find their cultural origins, etc. And it is this loss of confidence in our ability to present these big overarching stories about who we are and where we are in the world and in the cosmos that is the part of the central tenet of postmodernity. This feeling of a loss of a big other as such, organising it. And you can put that in quite simple terms. Postmodernity, quite fundamentally, involves the experience of the loss of metaphysics, the loss of some great big overarching principle that secures where we are in the world, tells us who we are, and directs us forward in a particular way. So Lyotard is concerned then, firstly, with the way in which we cannot tell these great progressive overarching stories. And in fact, he says, maybe now we just have to see the world fall into all these little competing narratives. In fact, he uses the term paganism before he uses the term postmodernity. He feels that this age is like a pagan age because now we no longer have the single monotheistic God overseeing the well-being of Europe, and instead we just have all these different little factions trying to argue for their own particular world view. And Lyotard says, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. Maybe there's something ethical in this. And what he's trying to get at is the way that those big stories, those big overarching meta-narratives, fueled endeavours like the imperialist movement, the great missionary expansion, in which often we went out into the world and we tried to turn it into the same as us, imposing our worldview upon others. So Lyotard sees this breakdown, the overarching meta-narrative, into smaller narratives as a way forward, in as much as there is a certain ethical justice in constantly negotiating small localized narratives. And this obviously in the first instance has important implications for theology, because theology of course has traditionally seen itself as a meta-narrative. It is in some senses trying to tell a story about the whole world and its progression and situate us in the world in the light of that. Now there's some dispute over whether Lyotard himself was actually imputing Christianity as a meta-narrative or whether he was really talking about the way that we try to justify who we are with appeals to a particular scientific discourse. But nonetheless, if you are a Christian, the postmodern experience that incredulity towards meta-narratives is in the first instance going to make you think about the confidence with which you can roll out your theological vision or mission or engage in mission, for example. So you might see it as much more of a return to a sort of localism, a return to the roots of culture, etc. In the second instance, Lyotard was concerned with the increasing influence of digital technologies upon society. Because you might say that in the past, the question of knowledge was, in a sense, grounded in the great institutions of universities. But knowledge is everywhere now. You can access it on the internet, you can access it on social media, and so the real question is who controls that knowledge now? Once the overarching meta-narratives break down and we just have the sort of a digital world in which we live and access at our own will various types of, who controls all that knowledge? We've seen, for example, in America, the rise of the issue of fake news. Who controls knowledge when it is put into the digital medium? And this is a primary concern for Lyotard, and it's a primary concern because it gets at the question of power. It gets at the question of power, who has the power, who controls the knowledge, and it also gets at the question of critique. How do we perform critique? Now, this is a very important question. It's a very important question. Why? Because a lot of postmodernist thinkers came out of the great Marxist tradition and the desire, in the light of the global success of capitalism, to continue to perform a political critique of the economy. Can we just assume that global capitalism has provided all the answers and emancipation of the workers, etc.? Or have we just created, for example, a new working class stuck out in the Philippines, for example? You may be familiar, for example, with the suicide nets that they often place under factories. So I believe the Apple factory in the Philippines has a suicide net outside the windows. It stops people jumping out and killing themselves. Yeah. So have we, in the name of capitalism, overcome the problematic of the economy, or have we just changed the coordinates a little bit, so now the working class are over there out in the east, and so we don't experience it so much? So the question is,